The frozen wasteland of Camp 47 stretches endlessly across the Siberian tundra, where the temperature hasn't risen above -30 in 3 months. For Klaus Richter, prisoner 4471, this morning starts like every other, with the crack of rifle butts against wooden bunks and the familiar taste of blood in his mouth. But today, something is different. Klaus forces himself upright, his ribs protesting from last week's beating. Guard Petrov had been in a particularly foul mood, and Klaus's ration of watery soup had paid the price along with his torso. Around him, skeletal figures shuffle through the morning ritual of pretending to be alive for another day. The barracks reek of unwashed bodies, festering wounds, and the sweet stench of men dying slowly. Schnell! Schnell! The guards bark their broken German, mixing Russian curses that Klaus has learned to decode through 6 brutal months of imprisonment. He pulls on his threadbare coat, the same Wehrmacht uniform that once held pride, now reduced to grey rags that offer little protection against the Siberian cold that seeps into bones and never leaves. The roll call proceeds with mechanical precision, names called, numbers confirmed, bodies counted like livestock. Klaus stands at attention despite his body's rebellion, knowing that any sign of weakness invites violence. 3 men died in the night. He counted the still forms that wouldn't rise when the guards came through. By tomorrow, fresh prisoners will fill their bunks, and the cycle will continue. As Klaus shuffles toward the coal mines with 300 other broken men, he spots the new camp commander stepping from a black military vehicle. The man's face stops Klaus's heart cold. Major Dmitri Volkov, the same Soviet officer Klaus saved from a burning tank outside Stalingrad, when mercy meant treason and helping the enemy could have meant execution. The memory crashes through Klaus's carefully constructed mental defenses. December 1942, the frozen hell of Stalingrad's outskirts. A Soviet T-34 burning like a metal funeral pyre, screams echoing from within. Klaus had been advancing with his unit when he saw the trapped figure trying desperately to escape through the commander's hatch. Something human had overridden his training. While his comrades pressed forward, Klaus had dragged the unconscious Soviet officer from the inferno, pulled him into a shell crater, and disappeared before the man regained consciousness. Now that same man stands 50 meters away, his breath forming white clouds in the bitter air as he surveys his new domain. Volkov has aged. His face bears the carved lines of war and command. His left hand is missing 2 fingers that Klaus remembers being whole, and there's a scar running from his temple to his jaw that wasn't there before. But the eyes are the same, intelligent, calculating, and merciless when duty demands it. Klaus forces his gaze downward, adopting the defeated posture that has kept him alive this long. His heart hammers against his ribs as Volkov's inspection begins, the major walking slowly down the line of prisoners with the practiced eye of a man cataloguing resources rather than acknowledging human beings. "This one," Volkov says in Russian, stopping directly in front of Klaus. His voice carries the authority of absolute power, but there's something else beneath it, a curiosity that makes Klaus's blood turn to ice water. Prisoner number 4471, Comrade Major, Guard Petrov responds with the eager deference of a man who knows his career depends on pleasing his new commander. Former rank? Klaus keeps his eyes fixed on the frozen ground as Petrov consults his clipboard. Wehrmacht Hauptmann, sir, infantry, captured at the Oder crossing. Volkov steps closer, close enough that Klaus can smell the tobacco on his uniform, the leather of his boots, the faint scent of real soap that belongs to a world Klaus barely remembers. "Look at me, prisoner." The command cuts through Klaus like a blade, slowly fighting every instinct that screams at him to run or fight or do anything but comply. Klaus raises his eyes to meet Volkov's gaze. For a heartbeat that seems to stretch into eternity, the 2 men stare at each other across the vast divide of war, imprisonment, and shared secrets. Klaus sees the moment of recognition flicker across Volkov's features, a tiny tightening around the eyes, a barely perceptible shift in posture. but the major's face remains impassive, revealing nothing to the watching guards. "Interesting," Volkov murmurs, then moves on without another word. The inspection continues, but Klaus barely registers the remaining proceedings. His mind races through calculations of survival and doom. Volkov knows the recognition was unmistakable, but what will he do with that knowledge? In this place where a single word from a commander can mean the difference between life and death, Klaus has become a walking secret that threatens them both. Now Volkov holds absolute power over Klaus's life, and neither man can acknowledge their shared past without destroying everything. In this place where a single misstep means death, Klaus must navigate 12 hours of backbreaking labor while hiding a secret that could save him, or get him killed. The morning siren split the air like a blade through bone. Klaus jerked awake, his body already moving before his mind fully surfaced from dreams of burning villages and snow-covered corpses. Around him, 200 men stirred in their wooden bunks, a symphony of coughs, groans, and whispered prayers in a dozen languages. He swung his legs over the edge of his bunk, bare feet hitting the frozen floor. The shock of cold shot up through his bones, but he welcomed it. Pain meant he was still alive. In Vorkuta, that counted as a victory. The man below him, Dmitri, a former Red Army sergeant who'd made the mistake of questioning Stalin's tactics, rolled over and fixed Klaus with bloodshot eyes. "You were talking again last night." Klaus pulled on his threadbare jacket, avoiding Dmitri's gaze. "Bad dreams. German words." The words hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Klaus had worked hard to bury his accent, to blend into the mass of prisoners who'd learned that anonymity meant survival. But sleep made him careless. Sleep made him remember. "We all have our ghosts, comrade." Dmitri sat up slowly, wincing as his damaged ribs protested. A gift from the guards 3 weeks ago when they'd caught him hoarding bread. Some ghosts are more dangerous than others. Before Klaus could respond, the barracks door crashed open. Guards flooded in, their rifles catching the weak morning light streaming through frost-covered windows. At their head strode a figure Klaus recognized, Senior Lieutenant Volkov, a man who wore cruelty like a well-tailored uniform. "Today we have visitors," Volkov announced, his voice cutting through the morning murmur. "Important men from Moscow who want to see how we handle enemies of the state. I suggest you remember your manners." Klaus kept his head down as the guards moved through the barracks, selecting men at random for the day's work details. Logging, mining, latrine duty. Each assignment was a roll of dice with death. But today felt different. Today carried an electric tension that made his skin crawl. They filed out into the compound, where the Siberian wind hit them like a physical blow. Klaus had been here 18 months, and the cold still took his breath away. Men died from that cold. They simply laid down in the snow and never got back up, their faces peaceful as children. The work assignments were read from a clipboard by a guard whose fingers had been frostbitten down to black stubs. Klaus found himself assigned to the lumber detail. Not good, but not the worst. He'd lived to see another sunset, assuming the trees didn't kill him first. As the groups began to disperse, Klaus caught a glimpse of black sedans pulling through the main gate, the visitors from Moscow. He watched 3 figures emerge from the vehicles, their thick coats and clean faces marking them as outsiders in this world of ice and suffering. The third man stepped into the morning light, and Klaus felt the world tilt beneath his feet. Even after 8 years, even softened by better food and warmer beds, the face was unmistakable. The same dark eyes that had looked down at him in a destroyed farmhouse outside Stalingrad. The same steady hands that had pulled shrapnel from his shoulder while German and Soviet forces raged around them in the winter darkness. Viktor Petrov, Major Viktor Petrov, now wearing the insignia of a full colonel and the confident bearing of a man who'd survived Stalin's paranoia to rise through the ranks. The partisan fighter who'd found Klaus bleeding out in that farmhouse, who'd patched his wounds and let him walk away into the snow instead of putting a bullet in his head. The same man who'd whispered in accented German as he'd worked over Klaus's wounds, We are not animals, not all of us. Klaus forced himself to look away, to blend back into the shuffling mass of prisoners. But even as his work detail began the trudge toward the forest, he could feel those dark eyes scanning the compound. Petrov was here for a reason. Men like that didn't make social calls to prison camps. The work detail passed through the outer gates under heavy guard, and Klaus risked one look back at the compound. Petrov stood near the administration building, speaking with Camp Commandant Kozlov. Even at this distance, Klaus could see the tension in their postures, the careful dance of men who didn't trust each other. Whatever had brought Petrov to Vorkuta, it wasn't a routine inspection. As they entered the forest, and the camp disappeared behind walls of pine and birch, Klaus found himself thinking about that night outside Stalingrad, about the choice Petrov had made to show mercy instead of following orders, about the debt that connected them across years and ideology. He shouldered his axe and approached the first tree, its trunk thick as a man's waist. The blade bit deep into the frozen wood, sending chips flying like shattered bone. In the distance, a wolf howled, lonely and desperate in the vast Siberian wilderness. Klaus understood the feeling. The morning whistle cut through the barracks like a blade, dragging Klaus from the shallow sleep that passed for rest in this place. Around him, men stirred with the mechanical movements of the half-dead, their bodies responding to conditioning rather than consciousness. Klaus kept his breathing steady, his eyes closed as boots thundered past his bunk. Through the thin walls came the familiar sounds of another day beginning in hell, guards shouting orders, dogs barking, the distant clang of metal on metal from the work details already forming in the yard. Klaus waited until the initial chaos subsided before opening his eyes. The bunk above him creaked as Dmitri, a scarred Ukrainian who'd been here longer than anyone, dropped to the floor. "Another beautiful day in paradise," Dmitri muttered in Russian, his voice thick with irony and phlegm. Klaus had learned enough of the language to understand the bitter jokes that kept men sane. Klaus sat up slowly, every joint protesting. The cold here wasn't just weather, it was an entity that lived in your bones, feeding on warmth and hope with equal appetite. He pulled on the threadbare jacket that served as his only protection against the elements, his fingers automatically checking the small tear in the lining where he'd hidden his most precious possession, a photograph of his sister Anna, taken the summer before the war changed everything. The mess hall was a study in controlled desperation. Men queued with the patience of those who knew that impatience brought only pain. Klaus took his place in line, eyes down, invisible. Survival here meant becoming a ghost in your own life, present but unnoticed. The gruel they served barely qualified as food, thin barley soup with occasional bits of gristle floating like small islands of disappointment. Klaus ate mechanically, his mind elsewhere. He'd learned to retreat into memory during these moments, to places where the sun warmed your face and food had flavor. "New arrivals yesterday," whispered Pyotr. An old man whose crime had been teaching German before the war made that tantamount to treason. 3 men from the Western Front. One of them keeps staring at the guards like he recognizes someone. Klaus's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. New arrivals always brought danger. They carried news from the outside world, reminded everyone of what they'd lost, but recognition was worse. Recognition meant complications. "Which guards?" Klaus asked quietly. "The new commandant, Volkov." Pyotr's eyes darted toward the front of the hall where guards stood watching the prisoners with the casual alertness of predators. Strange thing, though, the commandant was staring back. A chill ran through Klaus that had nothing to do with the Siberian air. He forced himself to finish eating, to maintain the routine that kept him alive. But his mind was racing, calculating possibilities, measuring dangers. After breakfast came work detail assignment. Klaus had managed to secure a position in the camp's makeshift medical station. His knowledge of anatomy from his father's veterinary practice had proven useful when the previous medic died of typhus. It wasn't comfortable work, but it kept him indoors and gave him access to information about who was sick, who was dying, and who might be planning something foolish. The medical station occupied a corner of the administration building, close enough to the commandant's office that Klaus could sometimes hear conversations through the thin walls. Today, as he organized their meager supplies, bandages made from torn shirts, antiseptic that was more water than alcohol, voices drifted through the wood. "Don't care what your records say, I know what I saw." The voice was unfamiliar, probably one of the new arrivals. "That guard, Volkov. I served under him in the Ukraine. He was Wehrmacht, not Soviet. Heinrich something. Heinrich Müller." Klaus's hands stilled on the bandages. The room seemed to contract around him, the walls pressing closer. Heinrich Müller. The name echoed in his memory like a stone dropped down a well, bringing up images he'd spent years trying to bury. "You're mistaken," came another voice. "Commissar Petrov, Volkov's political officer. Comrade Volkov has served the Soviet Union with distinction since before the war. Your memory is clearly affected by your circumstances. I'm telling you, I know that face. We held a village together near Kiev. There was an incident with partisans." The conversation moved away, but Klaus remained frozen, his mind reeling. Heinrich Müller. If the new prisoner was right, if Volkov was really a former Wehrmacht officer who'd somehow reinvented himself in Soviet uniform, then Klaus wasn't the only one in this camp living under a false identity. But knowledge was currency here, and currency could buy survival or death. Klaus resumed organizing supplies, his movements careful and deliberate while his mind worked through the implications. In a place where trust was a luxury no one could afford, he just learned that the man with absolute power over life and death might be the biggest liar of them all. The question was what to do with that information. The morning count proceeded with mechanical precision, each prisoner stepping forward as their number was called. Klaus stood in the second row, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air as he watched Volkov move down the line with practiced efficiency. The commandant's eyes swept over each face with the same cold indifference, giving no indication that he had recognized anyone the night before. "Prisoner 1847, Volkov called out in Russian." Klaus stepped forward, meeting the man's gaze for exactly the prescribed duration. 2 seconds, no more, no less. In those brief moments, he searched for any flicker of recognition, any sign that Mikhail Volkov remembered the desperate Wehrmacht officer he had pulled from the burning wreckage of a Panzer IV outside Kursk. But Volkov's expression remained granite hard, unreadable. "Present, Commandant," Klaus responded in halting Russian. Volkov moved on without pause, and Klaus fell back into line. Around him, the other prisoners maintained their rigid posture, knowing that any deviation from protocol could earn them a week in solitary confinement. The morning ritual continued for another 20 minutes before Volkov dismissed them to their work details. As the prisoners dispersed, Klaus found himself assigned to the logging crew, a particularly brutal detail that involved cutting and hauling timber in the deeper sections of the forest. The assignment felt deliberate, though he couldn't be certain whether it was punishment or simply coincidence. In the Gulag, paranoia was as much a survival tool as it was a curse. The march to the logging site took 40 minutes through snow that reached their knees. Klaus walked near the middle of the column, keeping his head down and his thoughts carefully ordered. He had survived 3 years in this place by maintaining an invisible profile, never drawing attention to himself, never giving the guards reason to single him out. But now everything had changed. The work was backbreaking. Klaus swung his axe with methodical precision, each blow carefully calculated to conserve energy while meeting the daily quota. Around him, other prisoners worked with the same grim determination, their faces gaunt from malnutrition and constant cold. Few spoke. Conversation was discouraged, and energy was too precious to waste on words. By midday, Klaus had felled 2 medium-sized pines and was beginning work on a third when one of the newer prisoners collapsed near the hauling station. The man had been struggling for weeks, his body slowly surrendering to the combined assault of inadequate food, brutal cold, and relentless labor. Now he lay motionless in the snow, his face gray with exhaustion. The guards responded with typical efficiency, Two of them dragged the unconscious prisoner to a nearby tree and left him there while the rest of the crew continued working. Klaus recognized the cruel mathematics of the Gulag. If the man recovered enough to work, he would be allowed to continue. If not, he would be left to die where he lay. As the afternoon wore on, Klaus became increasingly aware that one of the guards was watching him more closely than usual. Senior Sergeant Petrov, a thick-set Siberian with dead eyes and scarred hands, had positioned himself where he could observe Klaus's section of the work detail. Several times, Klaus caught the man's gaze lingering on him with what seemed like calculated interest. The sun was already beginning its early descent toward the horizon when Petrov approached. Klaus continued working, though every muscle in his body tensed as the guard's boots crunched through the snow toward him. "You," Petrov said in Russian, his voice carrying the flat authority that brooked no argument. "Commandant wants to see you." Klaus felt his blood turn to ice water. In 3 years he had never been summoned to see Volkov personally. Prisoners who received such invitations rarely returned unchanged, and many didn't return at all. He set down his axe and followed Petrov without comment, though his mind raced through possibilities. The walk back to the main camp seemed to take forever. Klaus tried to read meaning into Petrov's posture, his pace, the set of his shoulders, but the guard revealed nothing. They passed through the main gate as evening count was beginning, other prisoners forming up in their designated areas, while Klaus was led toward the administrative building. Volkov's office occupied a corner of the structure, its windows facing both the main yard and the forest beyond. Klaus had seen the warm yellow light glowing from those windows on countless winter evenings, always wondering what kind of man could find comfort in such a place while hundreds of prisoners suffered in the barracks below. Now he was about to find out. Petrov knocked once and entered without waiting for a response. "The prisoner you requested, Commandant." Volkov sat behind a simple wooden desk, reviewing what appeared to be personnel files by lamplight. He didn't look up immediately, letting Klaus stand at attention while he finished reading. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. Finally, Volkov raised his eyes. "Sit," he said in German, gesturing to the single chair positioned in front of his desk. Klaus remained standing, uncertain whether this was a test or genuine invitation. "I said sit, Lieutenant Weber." The use of his former rank and real name hit Klaus like a physical blow. The morning roll call stretched endlessly in the bitter wind, each name echoing across the frozen compound like a death knell. Klaus stood rigid in formation, his breath forming crystalline clouds as he fought to keep his expression neutral. 3 rows ahead, Volkov's voice carried over the assembled prisoners, steady and mechanical as he read from his clipboard. "Prisoner 4127, present. Prisoner 4128. Klaus's number was 4156. 28 names between him and the moment when their eyes would meet again. He counted each one, feeling his heartbeat accelerate despite the cold numbing his extremities. The night had passed without sleep, his mind churning through fragments of memory, the bridge, the uniform, the hand that had pulled him from certain death. Prisoner 4149, present. 7 more. Klaus's fingers twitched involuntarily, remembering the weight of the Luger that should have been at his hip. In the camp, weapons were forbidden to prisoners, but the instinct remained. His training whispered tactics, escape routes, weak points in the fence line, guard rotations he'd memorized over months of careful observation. But none of it mattered if Volkov chose to reveal what he knew. Prisoner 4154, present. 2 more. Klaus forced himself to breathe slowly, drawing the Arctic air deep into his lungs. The cold was his ally now, providing a reason for any tremor, any involuntary reaction. Around him, the other prisoners swayed slightly in their thin uniforms, focused only on surviving another day. None of them knew they stood beside a man whose past could destroy him with a single word. Prisoner 4156. The silence stretched for 3 heartbeats before Klaus realized his mistake. "Present," he called out, his voice rougher than intended. Volkov's eyes found his across the distance, and for a moment that felt like eternity, recognition flickered between them. Then the Soviet officer's gaze moved on, professional and detached. Prisoner 4157, present. The roll call continued, but Klaus heard nothing else. His focus remained locked on Volkov's profile, searching for any sign of what would come next. The man looked older than Klaus remembered, deeper lines around the eyes, grey threading through dark hair beneath his fur cap, but the bearing was the same, that careful precision that had marked him even in civilian clothes on that bridge in Warsaw. When the formation finally dispersed, Klaus moved with the crowd toward the work assignments, keeping his head down while tracking Volkov's movement peripherally. The commandant spoke briefly with another guard, their conversation lost in the shuffle of boots on frozen ground. Then Volkov turned and walked directly toward the administrative building, his stride purposeful. Klaus felt a hand grab his arm. "This way, German," growled Sergeant Petrov, one of Volkov's subordinates. The grip was firm enough to leave bruises, steering Klaus away from the general work detail. "Special assignment today." The words hit Klaus like a physical blow. He allowed himself to be guided, mind racing through possibilities. Special assignment could mean interrogation, isolation, or worse. It could mean a bullet in a maintenance shed where no one would ask questions. As they approached a smaller building he'd never entered, Klaus caught a glimpse of Volkov disappearing into his office. Petrov pushed open a heavy wooden door, revealing a storage room lined with shelves of cleaning supplies and maintenance equipment. "Inventory," the sergeant grunted, thrusting a clipboard into Klaus's hands. "Count everything, mark down condition, no talking, no breaks until finished." Then Petrov was gone, the door closing with a solid thunk that echoed like a coffin lid. Klaus stood alone among the shadows and chemical smells, staring at the Cyrillic text on the clipboard that might as well have been hieroglyphics. The isolation felt deliberate, a chance for private conversation or preparation for something worse. He began mechanically examining the shelves, his hands moving without conscious direction while his mind processed the situation. Volkov could have identified him immediately during roll call, could have ordered his execution with a single command. Instead, he'd chosen this: separation from witnesses, time to think. The question was whether that time was for Klaus's benefit or Volkov's. The door opened again after what felt like hours but had probably been minutes. Klaus didn't turn around immediately, finishing his count of paint cans before acknowledging the presence behind him. When he finally faced the door, Volkov stood silhouetted against the grey light from outside, his expression unreadable. "Inventory proceeding well. Prisoner 4156. Volkov's voice carried no inflection, but Klaus caught the slight emphasis on his number. "Yes, Commandant." Klaus kept his own tone equally neutral, though his grip tightened on the clipboard. Volkov stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. The space suddenly felt cramped, charged with tension that had nothing to do with the cold. For several seconds neither man spoke, each waiting for the other to make the first move in a game whose rules had yet to be established. Finally, Volkov's mouth curved into something that might have been a smile. Warsaw was a long time ago. The ladle trembled in Heinrich's grip as he ladled thin gruel into outstretched bowls. Each prisoner who shuffled past him in the mess line was a study in gradual death. Sunken cheeks, hollow eyes, fingers like winter twigs. But Heinrich barely saw them. His mind replayed the morning's encounter with Volkov over and over, searching for any sign that his identity had been compromised. "Move faster, German pig," barked Sergeant Petrov, the thick-necked guard who supervised meal distribution. Heinrich quickened his pace, spilling precious drops of the watery soup. In this place, wasting food was nearly as grave a sin as escape. 3 prisoners down the line, he recognized the face of Dmitri Kozlov, the Russian intellectual who'd been arrested for counter-revolutionary activities, which apparently meant owning books in French. Dmitri's eyes met Heinrich's with the briefest flicker of understanding. They'd developed a careful alliance over the past months, sharing information and extra rations when possible. The new commandant inspected the quarry today, Dmitri whispered as Heinrich filled his bowl. Asked many questions about productivity, about the workers. Heinrich's blood chilled. What kind of questions? Specific ones, about individuals. Dmitri's voice dropped even lower. About you. The next prisoner shoved forward impatiently, and Dmitri melted back into the crowd. Heinrich's hands moved automatically, continuing to serve while his mind raced. Volkov was hunting, testing, probing. But for what? Recognition? Or something else entirely? After the meal service, Heinrich was assigned to evening wood detail, hauling logs from the storage yard to the kitchen and administrative buildings. The work was backbreaking, but it offered something precious: mobility. As he dragged split timber across the compound, he could observe, listen, gather intelligence. The administrative building buzzed with unusual activity. Through a partly open window, Heinrich caught fragments of conversation between Volkov and his adjutant, a nervous young lieutenant named Sokolov. Files from Moscow arrived this afternoon. Background checks on all long-term prisoners. Special attention to any with military experience. Heinrich's blood turned to ice water. Files from Moscow. Background checks. His false identity as Klaus Richter, minor factory worker from Dresden, wouldn't survive serious scrutiny. Not if Moscow had comprehensive records. He dropped his load of wood and moved closer to the building, pretending to reorganize the scattered logs. Through the window, he could see Volkov hunched over a desk covered with manila folders. The commandant's scarred face was illuminated by lamplight, those steel-grey eyes scanning document after document with methodical precision. "Sir," Lieutenant Sokolov ventured hesitantly, "perhaps we should focus on the more recent arrivals. These older prisoners have already been thoroughly processed." "Thoroughly." Volkov's voice carried a dangerous edge. "You think our predecessors were thorough, Lieutenant? They were lazy, corrupt, more interested in vodka than vigilance." He slapped a folder shut. Real enemies slip through when men grow complacent. Heinrich felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the Siberian cold. Real enemies. Was Volkov speaking generally, or did he suspect something specific? The commandant's methodical approach suggested a man who left nothing to chance, who would eventually uncover every buried secret in this frozen hell. Movement in the yard caught his attention. Yuri Valenko, the camp's most feared informant, was making his evening rounds. The weasel-faced Ukrainian had survived 3 years in the Gulag by trading information for favors. He sidled up to Heinrich with his characteristic oily smile. "Busy evening," my German friend Yuri said, lighting a precious cigarette, a sure sign he'd recently provided valuable intelligence to the guards. "Much excitement in the commandant's office, yes?" Heinrich continued stacking wood, keeping his expression neutral. "I wouldn't know. I do my work, nothing more." Of course. Yuri's smile widened. "But a man notices things. The new commandant, he's very thorough, very interested in the past." "Some men, they have interesting pasts, yes? Worth investigating." The threat was barely veiled. Heinrich met Yuri's gaze steadily. "My past is no secret. Factory worker, Dresden, captured during the bombing. Nothing interesting about it. But, you see, interesting is in the eye of the beholder." Yuri took a long drag from his cigarette. "The commandant, he has very sharp eyes, very good memory. Sometimes he recognizes faces from before the war, from different circumstances." Heinrich's hand tightened on a piece of firewood, calculating whether he could kill Yuri quietly and dispose of the body. But the Ukrainian stepped back, as if reading his thoughts. "Just friendly advice between prisoners," Yuri said, dropping his cigarette and crushing it under his boot. "Men with secrets should be very, very careful. Walls have ears, and some ears belong to people with excellent memories." As Yuri slithered away into the darkness, Heinrich realized the game had shifted again. It wasn't just Volkov he had to worry about now. The entire camp ecosystem was stirring, sensing opportunity in the new commandant's investigation. In this place where information was currency and betrayal was survival, Heinrich found himself balanced on a knife's edge between discovery and death. The mess hall buzzed with the usual cacophony of metal spoons against tin bowls and muted conversations in a dozen languages. Klaus kept his head down, mechanically spooning the watery gruel that passed for soup, but his eyes tracked every movement in his peripheral vision. 3 tables away, Volkov sat with the other guards, their voices carrying across the room in sharp Russian syllables. Since their encounter at the infirmary 2 days ago, Klaus had felt the weight of observation pressing down on him like a physical force. Not just from Volkov, though the commandant's steel-grey eyes seemed to find him wherever he went, but from the other prisoners as well. Word had somehow spread that he'd been singled out, marked for special attention. In the delicate ecosystem of the camp, any deviation from routine was cause for suspicion. "You're making them nervous," whispered Dmitri, the old Ukrainian who'd become Klaus's unlikely ally. The man had survived 3 winters in this frozen hell through a combination of cunning and invisibility. "Whatever game you're playing with Volkov, it's putting us all at risk." Klaus didn't respond immediately. How could he explain that he wasn't playing any game at all, that he was trapped in a nightmare where past and present had collided with devastating force? Instead, he took another spoonful of soup and let his gaze drift toward the guards' table. Volkov was watching him. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and for a moment Klaus was transported back to that blood-soaked battlefield outside Stalingrad. He could almost smell the cordite and smoke, feel the bitter cold that had numbed his fingers as he'd crawled through the rubble of a destroyed building, bleeding and barely conscious. A Soviet soldier had found him there, young, maybe 19, with the same grey eyes that now studied Klaus with predatory interest. The soldier could have put a bullet in Klaus's head, should have, by all military logic. Instead, he'd dragged Klaus to safety, hidden him in a bombed-out cellar, and brought him water and bread stolen from his own rations. For 3 days, as the battle raged overhead, the Soviet soldier had kept Klaus alive. Klaus had never known his savior's name. In the chaos of war, such details seemed unimportant, but he'd never forgotten those eyes. Now those same eyes belonged to his captor, and Klaus understood with crystal clarity that his survival depended on ensuring Volkov never realized the connection. The commandant might have saved his life once, but in this place, mercy was a luxury neither of them could afford. A commotion near the kitchen broke his reverie. 2 prisoners were arguing over something, bread rations from the sound of it. Their voices escalated and suddenly one shoved the other. Within seconds, guards were moving, batons drawn. Klaus used the distraction to slip away from his table, following the flow of prisoners as they pressed against the walls to avoid the guards' attention. But instead of heading for the exit with the others, he ducked through a service door that led to the kitchen's storage area. The narrow corridor was dimly lit and filled with the smell of rotting vegetables and industrial soap. Klaus moved quickly, his soft-soled boots making no sound on the concrete floor. He'd been watching the patterns of the guards, timing their rounds, and he knew he had perhaps 3 minutes before someone noticed his absence. At the end of the corridor was a small office where the kitchen supervisor kept inventory records. More importantly, it was where the guards sometimes retreated for cigarettes and vodka when they thought no one was looking. Klaus had seen Volkov use this room twice in the past week. The door was unlocked. Inside, the office was spartanly furnished. A desk, 2 chairs, a filing cabinet with a broken lock. Klaus moved to the desk and began searching through the papers scattered across its surface. Supply requisitions, prisoner work assignments, medical reports. Nothing that would tell him what Volkov might remember about their shared past. But in the bottom drawer, his fingers closed around something unexpected. A leather journal, its pages filled with handwritten Cyrillic text. Klaus's Russian was functional, learned during his years of military service, and as he scanned the entries, his blood went cold. They were Volkov's personal observations about the prisoners, detailed notes about their backgrounds, their weaknesses, their potential value as informants or threats to camp security. Klaus flipped through the pages until he found his own entry, dated the day after his arrival. Subject exhibits military bearing despite attempts to conceal training. Possible officer rank. Bears watching for escape attempts or resistance activities. Note, subject reminds me of someone, though I cannot place where or when. Klaus closed the journal with trembling hands. Volkov suspected something but hadn't yet made the connection. The question was whether Klaus could maintain his facade long enough to... Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Klaus replaced the journal exactly as he'd found it and moved to the window, pressing himself against the wall beside it. Through the glass he could see the exercise yard where prisoners shuffled through their mandatory outdoor time despite the driving snow. The door opened and Volkov stepped inside. The metal cup slipped from Klaus's numb fingers, clattering against the concrete floor. Watery gruel splattered across his boots, but he barely noticed. His eyes remained fixed on the figure standing in the doorway of the mess hall, the silhouette that had haunted his dreams for 8 years. Dmitri Volkov stepped into the fluorescent light, his commander's uniform crisp despite the Siberian cold. The scar along his jawline caught the harsh illumination, a pale line that Klaus remembered tracing with desperate fingers in a different life, in a different war. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and for one terrifying moment, Klaus saw recognition flicker in those dark depths. Then Volkov's expression went blank, professional. He surveyed the prisoners with the detached efficiency of a man cataloguing livestock. When his gaze passed over Klaus again, there was nothing. No acknowledgement, no spark of memory, just the cold assessment of a Soviet officer examining another broken German. "Attention!" Volkov's voice boomed across the hall. "I am Commander Volkov, your new commandant. Under my authority, this facility will operate with absolute discipline. Any infractions will be met with severe consequences." Klaus forced himself to breathe, to appear as invisible as every other prisoner shuffling their feet in the oppressive silence. But his mind raced back to that frozen battlefield outside Stalingrad, to the moment when everything changed. The explosion had thrown him 20 meters from the burning tank. Snow mixed with blood in his vision as he crawled behind the wreckage, his left leg useless, bone jutting through torn fabric. German and Soviet forces had been trading artillery for hours, turning the landscape into a moonscape of craters and corpses. That's when he saw the Russian soldier, wounded, propped against a destroyed wall. Young, maybe 19, clutching a rifle with shaking hands. They stared at each other across 10 meters of no man's land, two dying boys in a war that had already consumed millions. Klaus raised his pistol, though his hand trembled with shock and cold. The Russian did the same. They held that deadly tableau as mortars whistled overhead, each waiting for the other to fire first. But then the building began to collapse. Now, 8 years later, that same Russian stood before him wearing a commander's stars. Klaus's throat constricted as Volkov began walking between the tables, occasionally stopping to examine a prisoner more closely. Each footstep echoed like a countdown. "You," Volkov said, stopping beside a skeletal man 3 seats down from Klaus. "When did you last bathe?" The prisoner stammered in broken Russian, fear making his words nearly incomprehensible. Volkov listened with apparent patience, then nodded to one of his guards. The man was dragged away without ceremony. Volkov continued his inspection, moving closer. Klaus studied his gruel, trying to control the tremor in his hands. He could smell the commander's approach. Tobacco, leather, and something else. Something familiar that made his chest tighten with memories he'd spent years trying to bury. "What is your name, prisoner?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Klaus looked up slowly, meeting those dark eyes that had once stared at him across a battlefield littered with the dead. Up close, he could see how the years had changed Volkov, harder lines around the eyes, a mouth that had forgotten how to smile. But it was definitely him. "Muller, sir. Klaus Muller. Your unit?" "6th Army, sir. Captured at Stalingrad." Volkov's expression remained neutral, but Klaus caught the slight tightening around his eyes. He knows. The certainty hit Klaus like a physical blow. But if Volkov remembered, why hadn't he said anything? Why the charade? Stalingrad, Volkov repeated, as if testing the word. Many died there. Yes, sir. Many more should have died. The words carried a weight that made Klaus's blood freeze. Around them, the other prisoners had grown silent, sensing the tension crackling between the two men. Even the guards seemed to lean forward, waiting. In that collapsing building, they had helped each other survive. Shared water, shared body heat through the endless night as the battle raged around them. By morning, they weren't enemies anymore, just two human beings clinging to life in the heart of hell itself. When the Soviet reinforcements arrived, Volkov could have identified him as Wehrmacht. Instead, he'd pointed in the opposite direction when asked about German survivors. Now that same man stood over him with absolute power, in a place where people disappeared without questions being asked. Klaus realized with crystalline clarity that his survival depended entirely on understanding why Volkov was hiding their shared past. "Finish your meal, Muller," Volkov said finally, turning away. "Tomorrow you begin work detail in the mines." As the commander walked away, Klaus caught something in his peripheral vision, a small piece of paper dropped beside his bowl. His heart hammered as he palmed it quickly, the familiar thrill of clandestine communication flooding his system. The game, whatever it was, had begun. The workshop fell silent except for the rhythmic hammering from the adjacent metalworking station. Heinrich kept his eyes fixed on the rifle component in his hands, but every nerve in his body screamed awareness of Volkov's presence just 3 workbenches away. The Soviet major moved with deliberate casualness between the prisoners, occasionally stopping to examine their work, his boots clicking against the concrete floor like a countdown timer. Heinrich's fingers traced the familiar contours of the bolt assembly he was supposed to be cleaning. How many times had he performed this same task during the war? But now, instead of maintaining weapons for the Wehrmacht, he was preparing Soviet armaments under the watchful eye of the man whose life he had saved in a burning T-34. "Muller," Volkov's voice cut through the workshop noise, using Heinrich's cover name. "Your section is falling behind quota." Heinrich looked up, meeting those steel-grey eyes that had haunted his dreams. Up close, he could see the faint scar along Volkov's left temple, a souvenir from that day in 1943 when shrapnel had torn through the tank commander's helmet. Heinrich had pulled him from the wreckage while Soviet reinforcements were still kilometers away. "My apologies, Major. The cleaning rod is damaged." Heinrich held up the bent metal tool, hoping his voice betrayed nothing. Volkov stepped closer, close enough that Heinrich could smell the tobacco on his breath. Then improvise. Resourcefulness kept soldiers alive during the war, didn't it? The question hung in the air like smoke. Heinrich felt sweat despite the workshop's chill. "So I've heard, Major." "Have you?" Volkov picked up the rifle component, examining it with professional interest. "This is a Mosin-Nagant bolt, reliable weapon, used extensively on the Eastern Front." His fingers moved over the metal with practiced familiarity, curious how German prisoners seemed to understand these mechanisms so well. Heinrich's throat constricted. The design is simple enough, not so different from other rifles. Indeed. Volkov set the bolt down with deliberate precision. "Tell me, Muller, what did you do before the war? Your file mentions you were a mechanic?" The lie felt heavy on Heinrich's tongue. "Agricultural equipment. Tractors, mostly." "Tractors." Volkov nodded slowly. "And during the war?" "I told you before. I was conscripted into labor service, never saw combat." The major's smile was thin as winter ice. "Of course, labor service." He gestured to the weapon components scattered across the workbench. "Yet your hands move like they've assembled more than tractors." Across the workshop, Dmitri was watching their exchange while pretending to sort screws. The old prisoner's weathered face showed concern, recognizing the dangerous territory this conversation was entering. Near the door, Guard Petrov stood with his rifle, but his attention was focused on a card game with another guard. Heinrich forced himself to continue working, his movements steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Metal is metal, Major. The principles are the same. Are they? Volkov leaned against the workbench. I sometimes wonder about the stories men tell to survive, the identities they construct, the past they bury. His voice dropped lower. But the past has a way of surfacing, doesn't it? Like bodies under spring ice. The metaphor hit Heinrich like a physical blow. He knew Volkov was probing, testing, but couldn't determine how much the Major suspected. Was this routine interrogation? Or did Volkov remember something from that day in the burning tank? I wouldn't know about such things, Heinrich replied carefully. Wouldn't you? Volkov straightened, his greatcoat rustling. I find that men who've truly lived through nothing have little to say about survival, but those who've seen death up close, he paused meaningfully, they understand that survival sometimes requires uncomfortable choices. Heinrich's hand tightened on the cleaning rod. The workshop suddenly felt smaller, the walls closing in. Everyone makes choices, Major. Yes, they do. Volkov glanced around the room, ensuring their conversation remained private. Some choices save lives, others destroy them. The fascinating thing is how rarely we know which we're making at the time. The words carried weight beyond their surface meaning. Heinrich sensed layers of implication, references to shared history that couldn't be spoken aloud. Was Volkov acknowledging what had happened between them? Or was Heinrich reading meaning into innocent words? I should return to work, Heinrich said. The quota can wait. Volkov's tone carried absolute authority. Walk with me, Muller. I want to discuss your progress. Heinrich's blood turned to ice water. A private conversation with the Major could mean exposure, torture, execution. But refusing wasn't an option. He set down his tools and followed Volkov toward the workshop's rear exit, feeling Dmitri's worried gaze on his back. As they walked past the other prisoners, Heinrich wondered if this would be his last time in the workshop. The game between them was escalating, and he still couldn't determine whether Volkov was predator or prey, or if the distinction even mattered anymore. The morning brought fresh snow and the familiar crunch of boots on frozen ground. Klaus worked methodically at the lumber pile, his movements calculated to appear purposeful while his mind raced through possibilities. Each log he lifted, each swing of his axe, served as cover for his surveillance of the compound. Volkov had not appeared at morning roll call. The absence gnawed at Klaus like a splinter under the skin. In 3 years, the commandant had missed count only twice, once during a party inspection and once when pneumonia had nearly claimed him. Neither explanation fit today's circumstances. German, Petrov's voice cut through the morning air. Commandant wants you. Klaus set down his axe, noting how the other prisoners avoided eye contact. Word traveled fast in the camp, carried on whispers and meaningful glances. They sensed something had shifted, though they couldn't name what. The administrative building felt different as Klaus entered. The usual bustle of activity had been replaced by an almost funeral quiet. Guards stood at attention with unnecessary rigidity, their eyes fixed on invisible points beyond the walls. Volkov's office door stood ajar. Klaus approached cautiously, his boots silent on the wooden floor. Through the gap he could see the commandant seated behind his desk, but something in the man's posture set off alarm bells. Too still, too perfect. Enter. The voice came from behind the door. Klaus pushed it open to find Volkov standing against the far wall, his service pistol drawn but held casually at his side. The man behind the desk wasn't Volkov at all, but Major Kozlov from the regional administration, a man whose reputation for solving problems preceded him wherever he went. Sergeant Richter, Kozlov said without looking up from the file spread before him. Your record makes for fascinating reading. Klaus remained silent, calculating distances and angles. The window behind Kozlov was barred. The door remained his only exit, but Volkov blocked that path. Captured at Stalingrad, Kozlov continued, turning a page. Processed through 3 different camps before arriving here, exemplary behavior throughout. His pale eyes finally lifted to meet Klaus's, almost too exemplary, one might say. The file contained more than Klaus expected. photographs from his Wehrmacht service, documentation of his movements through the prison system, even a detailed sketch of the facial scar that had marked him since childhood, the same scar that had allowed Mikhail to identify him all those years ago in the forest. "Major Kozlov is here to investigate certain irregularities," Volkov said, his voice carefully neutral. "It seems someone has been asking questions about old records, personnel movements from the war years." Klaus felt the trap closing around him, but kept his expression blank. "I don't understand." "Of course you don't," Kozlov smiled, but it held no warmth. "Tell me, Sergeant, what do you remember about the winter of 1942? Specifically December?" The question hit like a physical blow, but Klaus had prepared for this moment across sleepless nights. "We were retreating from Stalingrad. Everything was chaos." "Yes, chaos. Men separated from their units, officers making decisions that might seem questionable in hindsight." Kozlov's fingers drummed against the desk. "Some of those officers developed relationships with the enemy, arrangements that helped them survive when others didn't. I survived because I was lucky," Klaus said. "Lucky." Kozlov stood, moving around the desk with predatory grace. "Or perhaps because someone wanted you to survive, someone who recognized value in keeping certain secrets buried." The temperature in the room seemed to drop another degree. Klaus could hear his own heartbeat, could sense the weight of unspoken history pressing down on all three men. "There are those in Moscow," Kozlov continued, "who believe this camp has been run with unusual leniency, that certain prisoners have received special treatment in exchange for silence about wartime encounters." Now Klaus understood. This wasn't just about him and Volkov, this was about the entire network of former enemies who had found ways to coexist in the aftermath of war. Men who had made compromises, struck deals, buried truths that could destroy careers and lives. "I've been treated no differently than any other prisoner," Klaus said. Kozlov pulled a photograph from the file. "Then explain why you were recommended for reduced rations only twice in 3 years when men half your age have starved for lesser infractions." The photograph showed Klaus and Volkov during a work detail, standing closer than regulations typically allowed. Someone had been watching, documenting, building a case. Volkov finally spoke, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "Major, I think you'll find all decisions regarding prisoners have been properly documented and justified, perhaps. But documentation can be creative, especially when both parties have incentives to maintain certain fictions." Klaus realized that his next words would determine not just his own fate, but Volkov's as well. The man who had saved his life now needed saving in return. The snow continued falling outside, each flake another second, in a silence that stretched toward breaking. The morning air cut through Klaus like shattered glass as he stepped into the exercise yard. His breath formed small clouds that dissipated quickly in the merciless wind. Around him, other prisoners shuffled in their daily ritual of survival, some walking the perimeter with mechanical precision. Others huddled against the wooden walls, seeking whatever shelter they could find. Klaus had barely slept. Every creak of the barracks, every whispered conversation in the darkness had sent his nerves sparking. The weight of recognition sat heavy in his chest, a stone that threatened to drag him under with each breath. Volkov knew the subtle shift in the commandant's demeanor yesterday, the way his eyes had lingered just a moment too long. It was only a matter of time before the cat stopped toying with the mouse. "You look like hell," Dmitri muttered, falling into step beside him. The Russian's weathered face bore new lines of concern. "Worse than usual, I mean." Klaus forced his legs to maintain their steady pace around the yard's perimeter. "Just another day in paradise." "Don't give me that German stoicism. Something's eating at you." Dmitri lowered his voice. "Yesterday in the commandant's office, what really happened?" The question Klaus had been dreading hung between them like a blade. He could feel other prisoners nearby, their ears tuned to any conversation that might provide information, entertainment, or ammunition. Trust was a luxury none of them could afford, Yet somehow Dmitri had become the closest thing to a friend Klaus had known in years. He wanted to discuss work assignments, Klaus said carefully. Nothing more. Dmitri's grunt suggested he wasn't buying it. Volkov doesn't call individual prisoners to his office for work assignments. That's what the guards are for. He paused, studying Klaus's profile. You're scared. I can smell it on you. Before Klaus could respond, the sharp blast of a whistle cut through the yard. Guards emerged from their posts, rifles at the ready, herding the prisoners toward the center of the compound. Klaus's stomach dropped. Unscheduled assemblies rarely brought good news. They formed ragged lines in the snow, breath steaming, bodies pressed together for warmth. Klaus found himself in the third row, with Dmitri to his left and a skeletal Estonian to his right. The man's hand shook constantly now. Whether from cold or malnutrition, Klaus couldn't tell. Volkov emerged from the administrative building with theatrical precision. He wore his heavy winter coat, the fur collar framing his face like a crown. Behind him trailed two guards Klaus didn't recognize, their faces stone masks beneath their caps. Prisoners, Volkov's voice carried easily across the assembled men. We have a problem. Klaus felt his muscles tense involuntarily. Beside him, Dmitri shifted his weight, ready to move if necessary. The Estonian's shaking intensified. Yesterday, during the evening meal, several food items went missing from the kitchen stores. Volkov began walking slowly along the front line of prisoners, his eyes scanning faces with predatory interest. This represents a serious breach of camp discipline. A collective held breath seemed to grip the assembly. Klaus knew the penalty for theft. Everyone did. The missing items were recovered this morning during a search of the barracks. Volkov stopped walking and turned to face the prisoners directly. Hidden beneath the bunk of prisoner 2847, Klaus's blood turned to ice water. The Estonian beside him made a small, strangled sound. Alexei Petrov, Volkov called out, consulting a paper in his hands. Step forward. The Estonian's legs gave out. He would have collapsed entirely if Klaus and Dmitri hadn't instinctively reached out to steady him. The man's eyes were wide with terror, darting between the guards and Volkov like a trapped animal seeking escape. I didn't. Petrov's voice was barely audible. Please, I never. Step forward, Volkov repeated, his tone carrying the weight of absolute authority. Klaus felt the man's weight against his arm, the frantic trembling that spoke of complete breakdown. He'd seen this before, prisoners who reached their breaking point, who could no longer navigate the impossible mathematics of survival. But something felt wrong about this moment, orchestrated in a way that made Klaus's instincts scream warnings. Volkov's eyes swept across the third row, lingering for just a moment on Klaus's face. In that instant, Klaus saw something that confirmed his worst fears. This wasn't about stolen food. This was about sending a message. Two guards moved forward to collect Petrov, who had begun mumbling prayers in Estonian. As they hauled him upright, Klaus caught Volkov's eye again. The commandant's expression was unreadable, but Klaus detected something that might have been amusement. Let this serve as a reminder, Volkov announced as Petrov was dragged away. In this place, there are consequences for every action. Every choice carries weight. The assembly was dismissed with another whistle blast, but Klaus remained frozen in place as prisoners shuffled around him. Dmitri tugged at his sleeve, urging him toward the barracks, but Klaus couldn't move. The message had been received, loud and clear. The game had begun in earnest. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline silence that made every footstep crunch like breaking bones. Klaus pressed himself against the workshop's outer wall, watching through a gap in the boards as Volkov emerged from the administrative building. The commandant's breath formed white clouds in the frigid air as he barked orders at two guards who hurried toward the main gate. Something had changed. Klaus could see it in the rigid set of Volkov's shoulders, the way his hand rested on his sidearm. The careful dance they'd been performing for hours had shifted into something more dangerous. Inside the workshop, Klaus moved between the shadows cast by hanging tools and half-finished furniture. His fingers found the handle of a wood plane, not much of a weapon, but better than nothing. Through the frosted windows, he could see prisoners being herded back to their barracks earlier than usual. The camp was being locked down. The door creaked open behind him. Klaus didn't turn around. "You know," Volkov's voice carried easily across the empty space, "I've been thinking about Stalingrad, about that cellar where we waited for the artillery to stop." Klaus remained motionless, his back to the door. There were many cellars in Stalingrad, but only one where a German officer shared his last piece of bread with a wounded Russian sergeant. Volkov's boots scraped against the wooden floor as he stepped inside, closing the door behind him. Only one where two enemies became something else entirely. The admission hung in the air between them like a blade. Klaus finally turned, meeting those pale blue eyes that had haunted his dreams for years. "Alexei, so you do remember." Volkov's smile was cold, but Klaus caught something else underneath, relief perhaps, or resignation. "I wondered if you'd forgotten the man who crawled through German lines to get you medical attention." "I remember everything." Klaus kept his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "Including how you disappeared the next morning without a word. The war wasn't over. We both had our duties." Volkov began to circle slowly, like a predator testing its prey. "But that's not why you're here now, is it? This isn't some sentimental reunion." Klaus felt the weight of the wooden plane in his grip. "You tell me. You're the one who arranged my transfer here." "Did I?" Volkov's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "How interesting that you would think so. Perhaps you overestimate my influence in such matters." But Klaus saw the truth in the slight tightening around Volkov's eyes. The commandant had pulled strings, called in favors, or made deals to bring Klaus Richter to this frozen hell. The question was, why? 20 years, Klaus said quietly. 20 years you've been planning this. Planning what exactly? Volkov had completed his circle and now stood between Klaus and the door. "Your arrival here was merely fortuitous, a chance for old friends to reminisce. Friends don't lock friends in gulags." "Don't they?" Volkov's hand moved to his holster, unfastening the leather strap with practiced ease. "Perhaps you've forgotten how our friendship ended, how you left Stalingrad with information that killed 300 of my countrymen." The accusation hit Klaus like a physical blow. "That's not true? Not how you remember it?" Volkov's voice rose, echoing off the workshop walls. "You think I don't know about the radio transmission you sent? The one that directed your artillery to the hospital where my unit was sheltering?" Klaus felt the room spin around him. The hospital. He remembered the coordinates, remembered the desperate transmission as German forces retreated. But he hadn't known. "You couldn't have known that was where we were," Volkov continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Just as I couldn't have known when I gave you those very coordinates the night before, trusting you with the location of our wounded." The truth struck Klaus like shrapnel. "You blame me for doing what any soldier would do with intelligence given by the enemy. I blame myself for believing friendship could exist in the middle of hell." Volkov drew his pistol but didn't aim it, letting it hang loose at his side. "I blame myself for thinking you were different. And now? What is this? Revenge? Justice?" The word came out sharp and final. "Though I admit, after watching you these past months, I'm no longer certain which of us deserves it more." Klaus saw his chance as Volkov's attention wavered, the commandant lost in memories of a war that had ended decades ago but still raged in his mind. The wooden plane felt solid and reassuring as Klaus shifted his weight, preparing to lunge. But something in Volkov's expression stopped him. Not the gun, which still pointed at the floor, not fear of death, which had been his companion for months. It was the look of a man who had carried a burden too long and was finally ready to set it down. 20 years I've wondered," Volkov said softly, "if you ever thought about that cellar. About what we almost became." Klaus met his gaze directly. "Every single day. The morning light filtered through the grimy barracks windows. As Klaus pressed himself against the wall beside his bunk, watching the door, his body ached from another sleepless night, every nerve stretched taut like piano wire. Volkov's words echoed in his mind. "You have until tonight." The ultimatum hung over him like an executioner's blade. Other prisoners shuffled past, their faces hollow masks of resignation. They moved with the mechanical precision of men who had learned that survival meant invisibility. Klaus envied them their ignorance. They didn't know that their fate hinged on a conversation that had taken place in a frozen forest 17 years ago. "You look like death," Dmitri whispered, settling onto the adjacent bunk. The old carpenter's weathered hands trembled as he pulled on his boots, worse than usual. Klaus forced his breathing to steady. "Just tired." "We're all tired." Dmitri's pale eyes studied him with uncomfortable intensity. "But you're scared. I've seen that look before, in men who know the end is coming." The observation cut too close to the bone. Klaus had spent years perfecting the art of emotional concealment, yet this dying old man could read him like an open book. It was a dangerous weakness in a place where vulnerability meant death. "The foreman's been watching you," Dmitri continued, his voice barely audible. "Volkov. Yesterday, after you came back from the office, I saw him looking at you, not the way he usually looks at prisoners." Klaus's blood chilled. If Dmitri had noticed, others might have as well. In the brutal hierarchy of the camp, any sign of special attention from the guards could mark a man as an informant, a death sentence from his fellow inmates. "I don't know what you mean," Klaus said, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew they sounded hollow. Dmitri leaned closer, his breath visible in the frigid air. "My grandfather once told me a story about wolves. He said sometimes a wolf pack would accept a dog into their midst, let it run with them, hunt with them. But the moment that dog remembered it was once domestic, once owned by men, the pack would tear it apart." The metaphor wasn't lost on Klaus. He was the dog in this scenario, caught between two worlds, his past as a Wehrmacht officer and his present as a prisoner. Volkov represented the memory of domestication, the reminder of who Klaus had once been. The breakfast bell clanged, its harsh tone cutting through the morning gloom. Prisoners began filing toward the mess hall, their footsteps echoing off the wooden floors. Klaus rose to follow, but Dmitri caught his sleeve. "Whatever secret you're carrying," the old man said, "it's killing you from the inside. Sometimes it's better to face the wolves head-on than to let them smell your fear." Klaus pulled free without responding. Dmitri's wisdom was sound, but it came from a man who didn't understand the true stakes. This wasn't just about Klaus's survival, it was about honoring the debt he owed to a man who had once shown mercy to an enemy. In the mess hall, Klaus forced himself to eat the watery gruel, though his stomach churned with each spoonful. Across the room, he could feel eyes watching him. Not Volkov, the foreman wasn't present, but other prisoners. Word was spreading that something was different about the quiet German who kept to himself. Petrov, a mountain of a man with arms like tree trunks and a reputation for violence, approached Klaus's table. The conversations around them died as other inmates sensed the potential for entertainment or bloodshed. "You've been having private meetings," Petrov said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being feared. "That makes us nervous." Klaus met his gaze without flinching. "I haven't told them anything about anyone. Maybe not yet." Petrov's scarred hands rested on the table, close enough to grab Klaus if he chose to, but every man has his breaking point. The guards know this. They're patient. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Klaus understood the logic. From the other prisoner's perspective, his survival this long was already suspicious. Adding mysterious summons to the commandant's office only confirmed their worst suspicions. "I'm not an informant," Klaus said quietly, but he could see the doubt in the faces around him. Trust, once lost, was impossible to rebuild in a place like this. Petrov leaned back, apparently satisfied that he had made his point. "See that you remember where your loyalties lie." As the big man walked away, Klaus realized that Volkov's ultimatum had created an impossible situation. If he revealed the truth about their shared past, he would likely sign both their death warrants. If he remained silent, his fellow prisoners might kill him as a suspected informant, and if he fled, as Volkov had suggested, he would be abandoning the one man who had shown him mercy when mercy was the rarest commodity on earth. The day stretched ahead like an eternity, each hour bringing him closer to a decision that would determine not just his survival, but his soul. The shovel felt heavier with each scoop of frozen earth, but Klaus forced himself to maintain the steady rhythm that had kept him alive this long. Around him, other prisoners worked in similar mechanical silence, their breath creating small clouds that dissipated quickly in the bitter wind. The mass grave they were digging would soon hold another dozen souls who had surrendered to the unforgiving Siberian winter. From the corner of his eye, Klaus watched Volkov pace the perimeter of the work detail. The commandant's boots crunched against the snow-covered ground, each step deliberate and measured. There was something different about him today, a tension that radiated outward like heat from a dying fire. Klaus had learned to read such signs during his years of captivity. They usually preceded someone's death. "Deeper," Volkov commanded in Russian, his voice cutting through the wind. "The ground is still soft beneath." Klaus translated quietly for Heinrich, who worked beside him. The younger man's hands were raw and bleeding through his threadbare gloves, but he nodded and adjusted his grip on the shovel handle. They had been digging since dawn, and the sun was already beginning its brief arc toward the horizon. A commotion near the camp's main gate drew Klaus's attention. A convoy of vehicles approached through the snow, their engines straining against the cold. Even from this distance, he could make out the distinctive black sedans that typically carried officials from Moscow. His stomach tightened as he recognized the implications. Volkov had noticed the convoy too. The commandant's hand moved instinctively to his sidearm as he barked orders to the guards. "Continue working," he shouted to the prisoners, but Klaus detected the slight tremor in his voice that hadn't been there moments before. The vehicles came to a halt near the administrative building, and several figures emerged. Klaus couldn't make out their faces clearly, but their bearing suggested importance, the kind of importance that meant changes were coming to the camp. In his experience, such changes were rarely beneficial for the prisoners. "Something's happening," Heinrich whispered in German, leaning closer under the pretense of sharing Klaus's shovel. "Keep your head down," Klaus replied softly. "Whatever it is, we don't want to be noticed." But even as he spoke the words, Klaus felt Volkov's gaze settle on him with uncomfortable intensity. The commandant had stopped pacing and stood perfectly still, watching Klaus with the focused attention of a predator studying its prey. The weight of that stare made Klaus's skin crawl, and he forced himself to concentrate on the repetitive motion of digging. Minutes passed like hours until finally one of the guards approached their work detail. "Prisoner 347, he called out, using Klaus's camp designation. "The commandant wants to see you." A collective intake of breath from the nearby prisoners was barely audible above the wind, but Klaus heard it nonetheless. Being singled out for a private meeting with Volkov was typically a death sentence. He set down his shovel and wiped his hands on his prison uniform, buying himself a few precious seconds to think. Heinrich's eyes met his briefly, filled with the kind of desperate fear that Klaus had seen too many times before. The younger man understood what this summons likely meant, and Klaus saw his own mortality reflected in that terrified gaze. "Move," the guard commanded, gesturing with his rifle. Klaus nodded and began walking toward the administrative building, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him. Behind him, he heard the other prisoners resume their digging, though the rhythm seemed more frantic now, as if they could somehow work their way out of witnessing whatever was about to unfold. The warmth of the building's interior hit him like a physical blow after hours in the bitter cold. His fingers began to tingle as circulation slowly returned, and he flexed them unconsciously while following the guard down a narrow corridor. The familiar scent of tobacco and unwashed bodies filled his nostrils, mixing with something else. Fear, perhaps, or the metallic taste of impending violence. They stopped outside Volkov's office door. The guard knocked twice and waited for permission before opening it. Klaus stepped inside, immediately noticing that the room felt different from his previous visit. The air was thick with tension, and papers were scattered across the desk in apparent disorder. Most telling of all, Volkov stood with his back to the door, staring out the window at the convoy vehicles. "Sit," Volkov said without turning around. Klaus remained standing, uncertain whether compliance or defiance would serve him better in this moment. Outside the window, he could see more officials emerging from the vehicles, their dark coats stark against the white landscape. Whatever had brought them here was significant enough to warrant multiple representatives. Finally, Volkov turned to face him, and Klaus saw something unexpected in the commandant's eyes, not the usual cold calculation, but something closer to desperation. It was the look of a man who had run out of options and was preparing to make his final play. The makeshift blade felt cold against Klaus's palm as he pressed himself against the barracks wall, listening to the approaching footsteps. 3 sets, moving with military precision through the snow. Volkov had found allies, or perhaps the camp's hierarchy had finally decided the Germans' continued existence posed too great a risk to their carefully maintained order. Klaus closed his eyes, forcing his breathing to steady. The irony wasn't lost on him that after surviving the Eastern Front, Stalingrad, and 3 years in this frozen hell, he might die at the hands of the man whose life he'd once saved. But Dmitri was no longer that terrified boy hiding in a Leningrad basement. The war had carved them both into different creatures entirely. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Klaus heard the low murmur of voices, Volkov's among them. They were planning their approach, treating him like the dangerous animal the camp had made him. Smart. Klaus had killed before, would kill again if necessary. The blade in his hand was testament to that resolve. He's cornered now. Volkov's voice carried through the thin wall. No witnesses, no guards nearby. We finish this quietly. Klaus shifted position, moving deeper into the shadows between the bunks. The other prisoners had long since learned to make themselves scarce when violence approached. Survival in the Gulag meant knowing when to look away, when to forget what you'd seen. His death would be just another casualty in a place where men died daily from cold, disease, and despair. The door creaked open. Klaus could see their silhouettes against the pale light filtering through the entrance. Volkov in the center, flanked by 2 larger men, Klaus recognized as members of the camp's informal enforcement brigade, prisoners who'd bought their survival by becoming the system's enforcers. "Come out, Klaus!" Volkov called into the darkness. "Let's end this like soldiers, not like rats hiding in shadows." Klaus remained motionless. He'd learned patience during the siege of Leningrad, waiting in bombed-out buildings for the perfect shot, the right moment to strike. The same skills that had kept him alive then served him now. One of Volkov's companions stepped forward, a heavy-set man with facial scarring that spoke of violence endured and inflicted. He carried a wooden club, probably torn from one of the work detail implements. Crude but effective in close quarters. "Maybe he ran," the man suggested, his voice thick with a Ukrainian accent. "Could be halfway to the fence by now." Volkov shook his head. "He's here. He knows there's nowhere to run." He took another step into the barracks. "You saved my life once, Klaus. In Leningrad. Do you remember?" Klaus felt his grip tighten on the blade. Volkov was trying to flush him out with memories, using their shared past as bait. The irony cut deeper than any weapon. The boy he'd protected from German artillery was now hunting him with the methodical patience Klaus had taught him. "I was just a child then," Volkov continued, moving between the bunks with careful precision. "Terrified, starving, watching my city die around me. You could have left me in that basement, could have let the next bombardment finish what the siege started." The Ukrainian moved to flank Volkov's position, while the 3rd man remained by the door, blocking any escape route. They were executing a textbook search pattern, treating the barracks like enemy territory. Klaus admired the tactical discipline even as he calculated angles of attack. But you didn't leave me, Volkov said. You shared your rations, taught me how to move through the rubble without drawing sniper fire, showed me how to survive. His voice carried an odd mixture of gratitude and regret. You made me strong enough to become this. Klaus shifted his weight, preparing to move. The Ukrainian was getting close to his position, close enough that Klaus could smell the man's unwashed body, hear his labored breathing in the cold air, close enough to kill. The boy you saved is gone, Klaus. The war took him, just like it took everything else. What stands here now is what you helped create, a survivor who understands that mercy is a luxury the dead can't afford. The Ukrainian's boot appeared at the edge of Klaus's hiding spot. Klaus tensed, every muscle coiled for the strike that would either buy him precious seconds or mark the beginning of his final fight. I know you're listening, Volkov said softly. I know you understand. This isn't revenge, it's necessity. Your secret dies with you, and I continue living. Simple arithmetic. Klaus closed his eyes once more, thinking of Leningrad's ruins, of a terrified boy who'd clung to his uniform and wept silent tears while shells fell around them. That boy had deserved saving. The man he'd become deserved what was coming. The Ukrainian took another step forward. Klaus moved. The shovel felt like lead in Klaus's hands as he followed Petrov deeper into the forest. Snow crunched beneath their boots, each step taking them further from the camp, further from witnesses. The weak afternoon sun cast long shadows between the pine trees, creating a maze of light and darkness that seemed to mirror the deadly dance they'd been performing all day. Here, Petrov said, stopping beside a cluster of fallen logs. We dig here. Klaus studied the commandant's face, searching for any hint of what was coming. Petrov's expression remained unreadable, but there was something different in his posture now, a coiled tension that hadn't been there during their chess game, the familiar weight of the Luger pressed against Klaus's lower back, hidden beneath his coat. One quick movement and this could all be over. But then what? He'd be a fugitive in the Siberian wilderness, with no shelter, no food, and hundreds of kilometers from any hope of civilization. Perhaps this was exactly what Petrov wanted, to force him into a desperate act that would justify a bullet in the back. The ground is frozen, Klaus said, testing the earth with his shovel blade. Then we work harder. Petrov began attacking the soil with methodical strikes. Labor builds character, don't you think? The party believes honest work can redeem any man. Klaus started digging, keeping his movements deliberate and controlled. And what do you believe, Mikhail? The use of his first name made Petrov pause mid-swing. For a moment, something flickered across his features. Surprise, recognition, or perhaps fear. Then the mask slipped back into place. I believe in survival, Petrov said quietly. Nothing more, nothing less. They worked in silence for several minutes. The rhythmic scraping of metal against earth, the only sound besides the whisper of wind through pine boughs. Klaus's shoulders burned, but he welcomed the physical pain. It helped keep his mind sharp, focused on the present danger rather than the memories that threatened to overwhelm him. He was 12 again, cowering in the ruins of a bombed-out church while artillery shells screamed overhead. His mother's blood cooling on the broken stones. The Russian soldier who'd appeared like a ghost in the doorway, rifle raised, finger on the trigger. Those same dark eyes, now watching him dig what might be his own grave. You were younger then, Klaus said without looking up. Scared. We both were. Petrov's shovel clinked against a buried stone. I don't know what you're talking about. The church in Stalingrad. October 1942. You found me hiding behind the altar. Klaus straightened, his back protesting. You could have shot me. Should have, according to your orders. Instead, you gave me bread and told me to run west, away from the fighting. Many buildings were destroyed in Stalingrad. Many children died. Petrov's voice carried no emotion, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the shovel handle. One German boy looks much like another. Klaus reached slowly into his coat pocket, watching Petrov tense. But instead of the Luger, he withdrew something small and tarnished, a brass button, Wehrmacht issue, with the eagle and swastika barely visible after years of handling. "You pulled this from my coat when you found me," Klaus said. "Told me to keep it, to remember that even in war, not all enemies are monsters. I've carried it every day since." Petrov stared at the button as if it were a venomous snake. "Put that away." "Why?" "Afraid someone might learn that the great Commandant Petrov once showed mercy to a German child. That beneath all this," Klaus gestured at the uniform, the forest, the camp hidden beyond the trees. "You're still the man who chose compassion over duty? That man died in Stalingrad." Petrov's voice cracked like ice under pressure. "What you see now is all that remains." "No." Klaus pocketed the button and resumed digging. "That man saved my life, and now I'm going to save his." "By doing what?" "The past cannot be undone, Klaus. We are what this war made us. We are what we choose to be. You taught me that." Petrov laughed, but there was no humor in it. "And what do you choose? To die here in this hole, clinging to sentiment?" Klaus felt the familiar weight of the pistol against his spine. One motion, and he could end this standoff, but instead he kept digging deeper and deeper into the frozen earth. "I choose to trust you," he said simply. "The same way you trusted a German boy not to betray your position 23 years ago." When Petrov finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "You fool. You beautiful, stubborn fool." The shovel struck something hard beneath the frozen earth, and Klaus felt the vibration travel up through his arms. His breath came in ragged white puffs as he knelt in the shallow grave, fingers already numb despite the threadbare gloves. Around him, the other prisoners continued their grim work in silence, the only sounds the scrape of metal against stone and the whispered prayers of those still clinging to faith. "Deeper," came Volkov's voice from above. Klaus didn't look up. He couldn't risk meeting those eyes again, not when his own might betray the storm of recognition and memory that threatened to consume him. Instead, he focused on the task, on the methodical rhythm of digging that had become his anchor in this frozen hell. But even as he worked, his mind raced. The man standing guard over him was Alexei Petrov, the Soviet sniper who had pulled him from the burning wreckage outside Stalingrad, who had bandaged his wounds and shared his meager rations during that strange suspended moment when the war had paused between them. The same man who now wore a different name and watched Klaus dig graves for the dead with cold satisfaction. "You work with unusual precision for a common soldier," Volkov observed, stepping closer to the edge of the pit. "One might think you've done this before." Klaus forced his breathing to remain steady. "We all learn quickly here, Commandant." Indeed. There was something predatory in Volkov's tone that made Klaus's skin crawl, though some bring more experience than others. The shovel hit the hard object again, and this time Klaus realized what it was: another body buried in the permafrost from some previous winter. The camp's cemetery was layered with the dead, each season adding fresh corpses to the frozen ground. He adjusted his position, trying to work around the obstruction without acknowledging what it was. "Tell me, Bauer," Volkov continued, his boots crunching softly as he paced along the pit's edge, "what do you think of justice?" The question hung in the air like ice crystals. Klaus paused in his digging, sensing the trap that lay hidden in those words. "I think it's not my place to judge such things, Commandant. But surely you have opinions. A man who has seen what you have seen, done what you have done, such a man must have thoughts on the nature of justice and punishment." Klaus resumed digging, each strike of the shovel more deliberate than the last. Around them, the other prisoners had grown quiet, sensing the tension that crackled between guard and prisoner. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "I think," Klaus said carefully, "that we are all judged by forces greater than ourselves." Volkov laughed, but there was no humor in it. How philosophical. "And what of mercy? Do you believe in mercy, Bauer?" Now Klaus did look up, meeting those familiar brown eyes for the first time since their confrontation in the commandant's office. In them, he saw something that chilled him more than the Siberian wind. a terrible intelligence, calculating and patient. Mercy is not mine to give or receive, Klaus replied. No, but surely you have received it. After all, you are alive when so many are not. That suggests someone, somewhere, showed you mercy. The words were carefully chosen, deliberately weighted. Klaus felt the noose of recognition tightening around his neck. Alexei knew. Perhaps he had known from the moment Klaus arrived at the camp, had been playing this game for weeks, months even. The thought made Klaus's hands shake slightly as he gripped the shovel. "We survive by God's will," Klaus said, falling back on the neutral piety that had served him well in the camp. God's will. Volkov tasted the words like wine, or perhaps the will of men who choose to show compassion when they might choose otherwise, men who risk everything for a stranger, for an enemy even. The silence stretched between them, pregnant with unspoken knowledge. Klaus felt sweat freezing on his forehead despite the cold. In the distance he could hear the guards calling out orders, the normal sounds of the camp, continuing its brutal routine. But here, in this shallow grave, the world had contracted to just the two of them, the hunter and the hunted, though which remained unclear. Such men, Volkov continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, sometimes find themselves in impossible positions. They are forced to choose between their conscience and their survival, between their past and their future. Klaus set down the shovel and looked directly into Volkov's eyes. "What do you want from me?" The question came out more desperate than he'd intended, and he saw something flicker across the commandant's face. Satisfaction, perhaps, or recognition of a victory finally achieved. "Want?" Volkov smiled, and for a moment Klaus glimpsed the young man who had once saved his life. "I want nothing more than I have always wanted. Justice for the dead." The frozen earth beneath Klaus's boots crunched with each deliberate step as he walked toward the administrative building. Dawn was breaking over the camp, casting long shadows between the barracks, and the other prisoners were already forming lines for morning roll call. But Klaus had been summoned early. Volkov's message had been simple: come alone before the others wake. The guard at the door stepped aside without a word, and Klaus found himself in the same office where this deadly dance had begun just 24 hours ago. Volkov stood with his back turned, silhouetted against the window that overlooked the compound. On his desk lay two items that made Klaus's breath catch in his throat: his Wehrmacht identification papers and a bottle of vodka. "Close the door," Volkov said quietly. Klaus obeyed, the click of the latch echoing in the small room like a gunshot. For a moment neither man spoke. Outside, the camp was coming to life with the familiar sounds of shuffling feet and barked orders, but here in this room time seemed suspended. Volkov finally turned. His face looked older in the morning light, weathered by years of carrying secrets. "Do you know why I brought you here, Heinrich?" The use of his real name sent a chill down Klaus's spine. After months of being just another number, hearing his identity spoken aloud felt like standing naked before his executioner. "You're going to kill me," Klaus said simply. "The question is whether you'll make it quick or let me suffer first." A bitter smile played at the corners of Volkov's mouth. "Always so dramatic, you Germans. Sit down." Klaus remained standing. "I prefer to die on my feet." "Sit down," Volkov repeated, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "You're not going to die today." Confusion flickered across Klaus's features, but he slowly lowered himself into the wooden chair facing the desk. Volkov picked up the vodka bottle, uncorked it, and poured 2 glasses. He pushed one toward Klaus. "To survival," Volkov said, raising his glass. Klaus stared at the offering suspiciously. "Is it poisoned?" "If I wanted you dead, Heinrich, there are simpler ways." Volkov drank deeply from his own glass. "The train to Moscow leaves in 2 hours. Your execution order has been misplaced, lost in bureaucratic confusion. These things happen in wartime." "I don't understand." Volkov sat heavily in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his years. "That night in Stalingrad, when I pulled you from that rubble, I made a choice. a choice that haunted me through every subsequent battle, every dead comrade, every village burned to ash. I saved the life of my enemy, and I never understood why. He gestured to the identification papers on the desk. But yesterday, watching you face your death with dignity, refusing to beg or break even when you knew I held your life in my hands, I finally understood. Some acts transcend war, Heinrich. Some debts must be honored, even between enemies. Klaus felt the weight of 24 hours of terror and resignation slowly lifting from his shoulders. The other prisoners who recognized me will say nothing. They understand the consequences of spreading rumors. Volkov's eyes hardened momentarily. Besides, Klaus Weber is dead. He died in a mining accident yesterday evening. Very tragic. His body was never recovered. And Heinrich Müller remains buried in Stalingrad, where he belongs. Volkov reached into his desk drawer and produced a set of papers. Meet Dmitri Kozlov, Soviet citizen, born in the Urals, victim of mistaken identity, arrested by overzealous NKVD agents who confused him for someone else. A clerical error that has now been corrected. Klaus took the documents with trembling hands. The forgery was masterful, complete with work permits and travel authorization. Why are you doing this? Volkov was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the camp where hundreds of prisoners shuffled through their morning routine. Because I've seen enough death, Heinrich. Because in this place where humanity goes to die, sometimes the only way to stay human is through an act of inexplicable mercy. He stood and walked to the window again. The train stops in Novosibirsk, then continues west. You'll disappear in the chaos of displaced persons and refugees. Find a new life, somewhere far from here. Klaus rose slowly, clutching the papers that represented his resurrection. I won't forget this debt. Yes, you will, Volkov said without turning around. You'll forget this place, forget me, forget Klaus Weber and everything he did. That's the only way this works. At the door, Klaus paused. Victor, what you did in Stalingrad, pulling me from that rubble, it wasn't weakness. It was the most human thing either of us experienced in that entire war. Volkov's reflection in the window showed the faint trace of a smile. Perhaps. Now go, before I remember I'm supposed to be a loyal Soviet officer. Klaus opened the door and stepped into the corridor, leaving behind the man who had saved his life twice, once as an enemy, once as a friend.